Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 50th Annual National Patient Meeting. I'm Diana Clynes, Executive Director of the American Association of Kidney Patients, and I'm thrilled to welcome you back as we continue to celebrate the golden anniversary of this event. This year's meeting is appropriately titled 50 Proud Years of Patient Education, 50 Years of Saving Lives, 50 Years of Saving Livelihoods. It's meant to reflect on both the extraordinary progress we've made at AAKP over the years and the enduring mission that guides us. For 5 decades, AAKP has been committed to empowering patients, supporting innovation, and driving policy change to disrupt status quo kidney care. This meeting is not only a celebration of our past, but also a look ahead as we progress past the midpoint of the decade of the kidney toward a future that transforms kidney care through bold innovation, meaningful collaboration, and unwavering commitment to patients and families. Our next session here, Ready for Research, Preparing for Clinical Trial Participation, is proudly sponsored by AAKP's allied industry partner, Bayer Pharmaceuticals. In this session, you'll learn the essentials of clinical trials, what they are, how to find them, and the key questions to ask, and what to expect before, during, and after enrollment. Our goal is that you leave today with practical tools and confidence to make informed decisions about participating in research and with the knowledge to begin meaningful conversations with your healthcare team about trial opportunities. We're honored to be joined by an outstanding speaker who also happens to be among AAKP's strongest champions, and we're equally proud to be a champion of his as well. I'd like to introduce Mr. Cory Potts. With a background in microbiology and biochemistry from Texas State University, Cory has more than 20 years of experience in pharmaceutical research across multiple therapeutic areas. When he's not advancing clinical science, Cory enjoys life in his ranch north of Austin, Texas, where he and his wife raise their twins, grow fruit and nut trees, and spend time outdoors with their German short-haired pointer, Kimber. Please join me in welcoming Cory Potts to the podium as he starts our discussion.
Thank you. As she discussed, I am going to go through clinical trial participation, why it's important, and what to expect. And the story starts with a bit of a historical journey of mine. My grandfather, Orrin Potts, was born in 1911 in a very poor farming community about 2 hours south of here. You can see the Lampasas County there, sort of very central Texas. And you can see there, he and my brother and I, Jeff, and his name was Orrin, and myself. Basically, we were everything to him, and he was everything to us as well. You can see that growing up in the 19-teens and 1920s in America, in a farming community, the healthcare was very limited. Whenever he, later in life, was diagnosed with kidney disease, it came as sort of a shock. He wasn't really sure what to expect. Whenever he came home, we were still very young, and he showed us the port in his arm, and that he said basically that they informed him he had kidney disease, and it had gotten fairly advanced. They said that, with dialysis, maybe 3 to 4 times a week, that he had maybe a 2 to 3 year life expectancy, and he was in his early 70s at the time. So that didn't sit terribly well with him or the rest of the family. The medical provider told him, with diet and exercise and sort of life changes, that he could potentially extend it. Living in a rural community meant that he, as a 73, 4, 5-ish-year-old man, had to get himself about 90 miles away to a dialysis center, which was quite a hardship. He had already developed macular degeneration and was no longer driving. My grandmother drove him for the first couple of years until she also lost her sight. As a blessing, the dialysis center at Scott & White Hospital in Temple developed sort of a pickup and drop-off van service where they would come 90 miles and pick him up, 3 days a week. It was still a fairly grueling day for a 75-year-old man to wake up at 7 a.m., ride an hour and a half, do dialysis for 6 to 8 hours, and then an hour and a half home. He did this for almost 15 years, so he beat their estimate by a significant amount, and it was largely due to all the lifestyle changes and the very strict dialysis schedule that he kept. Point being, it was a very difficult journey for him, and this is 40 years ago, there were not a lot of options for, moderate to severe kidney disease. I say there were not that many options. There are many more options today for kidney disease. Having this knowledge, it has crossed my mind, will I also have kidney disease later in life? Will my kids have kidney disease later in life? So it starts one thinking about course of treatment. I don't think my grandfather actually participated in clinical research. I don't think one was actually offered to him, which is kind of a big obstacle in clinical research. Only about 5% of Americans have participated in a clinical trial, and very few more than that are ever offered a clinical trial. So that is really the big hurdle, is that there are tens of thousands of clinical trials ongoing in the U.S. today, and only 5% of people are ever offered one. Increasing awareness in providers, increasing awareness in patients is paramount. So we can see there that despite more than $130 billion in collective spending on pharmaceutical R&D, more than 90% of all new drugs fail in clinical trials. So that means more and more trials have to be performed, more and more participants have to volunteer in order for the research to be moved forward, basically. Furthermore, public participation in clinical trials is the foundation of research. It's important that we talk to each other and to our families and to our friends about clinical trials and how they are so necessary for new compounds and new treatments and new therapies to be approved. This brings us to who can volunteer for clinical trials. Pretty much anyone can volunteer for clinical trials as long as you know that one is ongoing. These volunteers basically will, come into a clinic. They're generally referred to the clinic by an organization such as AAKP that can turn you on to a research study. There are websites devoted to kidney clinical trials or cardiovascular clinical trials or, musculoskeletal clinical trials. You have to be aware that the clinical trial is ongoing before you would know to ask that. So it's paramount that we ask our doctors if they are involved in clinical trials and if they have anything that might help us or our families. So in a clinical trial, you basically would receive the same care as if you were not in that clinical trial, and then the trial will basically add certain procedures. It could be a medication, it could be a different type of therapy, and it will compare you to another individual who is also in the clinical trial that is on whatever the standard of care is. And that is currently the paradigm by which clinical trials are approved, is that there will be generally a standard of care for whatever is being tested, and then they add additional therapy on that so that they have sort of a one-to-one comparison. I would like to also say that pharma is limited by what can be said about clinical trials and about the therapies under test, because they are protecting patients' well-being. They do not allow pharma to say something is going to be beneficial until we know for sure that it's going to be beneficial. So you will see, the ads for these compounds kind of err on the side of risk, which you'll know if you've ever seen some of the ads for approved therapies. The list of side effects may include, and then they start going, and it seems like it takes half of the commercial to tell you all the side effects, and that's just because, in a very conservative fashion, the health authorities want potential patients to know their risks up front. Going back to that first stat about only 5% of Americans ever being told about a clinical trial, 95% of people who have participated in a clinical trial would consider joining another one. So it's very much not the case that only 5% participate in clinical trials because they're not helpful or that they're not good. Most people that do one are happy to do another one. It's just getting the information out to potential volunteers. What happens in clinical trials? So I talked about being referred to a treatment center. Just a basic overview. So you will be referred. You will potentially be referred to a treatment center. Where you will have, several questions about your health, medical history, that sort of thing. They will want to collect from your primary care physician a comprehensive list of all of your medical history so they can make sure that it fits into the parameters of the clinical trial. After all of that is done, they will generally schedule a screening visit where they will take your vital signs, take your EKG, height, weight, that sort of thing, and give you any sort of labs or diagnostic procedures that are applicable to the clinical trial. Generally, it takes a week or 10 days to get the results from those, in addition to get the results from whenever they have to query your primary care physician for medical records. Sometimes it can take a week or two. So there will be a delay in the beginning. Kind of to get the ball rolling. After they get your medical records, and assuming that all of the diagnostic procedures are positive for the trial, they will schedule a baseline visit or randomization visit, depending on how the clinical trial is set up, where you will come in and take basically most of the procedures that you took during screening will be done again to give them a little more confidence about the consistency of the data collected between the screening and the randomization visit. And then that information will be used as the baseline by which they compare the data after you have begun taking the therapy or the medication or the procedure or whatever the clinical trial is there to test. They want they want to see the before picture so that they have something good to compare it to for the after picture. So the clinical trial goes along for some amount of time, and generally whenever it draws to a close, let me back up. You'll come in at some frequency, whether it's weekly, monthly, for 2 weeks to 2 years. It just varies by trial, and all of that will be communicated to you in the beginning. But after the clinical trial, after all the visits have been completed, you will basically complete the termination visit, the last visit, and then maybe a phone follow-up visit or something like that. A lot of times they like to follow up by phone a couple of months just to make sure everything's okay and that no side effects have popped up after discontinuation of the therapy. So that in a nutshell is kind of what to expect as far as what you will have to, how many visits you have to make and how you do it, that sort of thing. As far as just, clinical trials can be placebo-based, where one group gets, they call it a sugar pill. It's actually just an inert substance. It could be sugar, it could probably not sugar, but it's just a white powder that's visually indistinguishable from the investigational agent that should have no effect on participants at all. So you can either get placebo, you can get not placebo. Or some of them, for very serious illnesses, it's not ethical to give a placebo. Everyone needs to get the active comparator or the active drug. So it just, like I said, it depends on how the clinical trial is set up as to what you receive. How am I protected? So the first thing that happens before you get into a clinical trial is you discuss it with the doctor, and then they will administer what's called an informed consent form. It's a very long document that basically tells you what's going to happen during the clinical trial. How many times you have to come, how many blood draws there are, how many vital signs there are, all of that sort of thing. It also goes into the risks of being on the clinical trial, whether it's you have to get a shot or you have to, I don't know. It basically just tells you everything that could potentially be a risk to you. It also will say, you may gain benefit from this and you may not, but it basically just lets you know everything up front so that you're well informed. How am I? So, what are your rights? You don't waive any rights by signing an informed consent. It does not, it does not waive any rights at all. It just says, hey, the doctor told me all of the risks. I know what the trial's about. Also, signing that consent does not compel you to do the whole clinical trial. If you don't feel good, if you think the drug's making you feel bad, or if you just aren't feeling great, if the visits are too many, if the visits are too long, discuss it with your nurse or doctor before withdrawing. They may be able to do something to mitigate, shorten the visits, or break them up to where it's a little bit more convenient for you. But you can leave the clinical trial at any time with no negative effects to your treatment. If you leave the clinical trial, you just go back to the treatment that you had before the clinical trial, whether that doctor is your primary or whether you go back to your normal doctor. One thing that I would like to highlight is that if you decide to not continue taking study drug, you may also still allow the doctor and the pharmaceutical company to use the data that's been collected so far. You can just stop taking the drug. They can call you on the phone and just say, hey, are you still okay? Everything good? Any new side effects? And it really helps provide data points because you have already put so much work into it at that point. It's a little bit, it would be a little bit discouraging to then not let anyone use that information. It could still be used to help potential patients in the future. Do participants still see their primary care doctor? Absolutely. Nothing really changes with your doctor, assuming they're not the study doctor. You would still go see your normal doctor during the course of a clinical trial. And then we talked about treatment being the same as, or being, I should say, similar to the standard of care if you are not on the active comparator. So how should I prepare for meeting the research coordinator? Just come with questions. You probably saw an ad, maybe someone told you about the study, you probably have questions. Just write them down, come to that first visit. They should be able to answer all of them for you. Some questions you should ask, maybe, depending on what your work hours, ask if they can see you after 4 p.m. Ask if they're open on Saturday. Ask if they have any provision for childcare. Clinical trials are getting more and more flexible all the time because people lead busy lives and they have a lot of responsibilities that might prohibit them from doing clinical trials if you have, say, a center that has very narrow hours, or they're only open 3 days a week, or that sort of thing. So providers are trying to be as flexible as possible to encourage people to do clinical trials. Risks, benefits, we talked about. The risks and benefits are all in that informed consent form. If you have specific questions, be sure and ask your doctor. Maybe a question that you have is not answered in the informed consent, and that doctor will have a direct phone line to the pharmaceutical company he can call and ask and get answers to your questions prior to participation. Do I get paid? That will generally be dependent on the study, but generally there is a patient travel stipend. They will pay your Uber, pay your mileage, pay your parking, that sort of thing. You should really incur no costs for participating in the clinical study. Sometimes they have what they call like an inconvenience or a patient burden stipend. We realize that people miss work sometimes to do these visits, so they can compensate an additional amount for that. So the benefits of clinical trials are, of course, access to new treatments. Depending on how many times you get to see your doctor, you might actually get to see your doctor more often doing clinical trials. There's possible compensation. As we already discussed, finishing the study, taking the study drug for the entirety of the study is not necessarily required for that data to have scientific impact. It can still be used if you only go partially through the study and allow them to use your data or keep collecting data. So clinical trials hopefully help not only us, but help others that come after us. So this is my daughter, Liberty. She is a twin. She is 16. I got asked a lot whenever I had twins, and they would be there in the stroller together, boy-girl twins, if they were identical. And I said, other than the obvious, differences, No, they're completely different. They're nothing alike. And as they got older, they became more and more dissimilar. She was a fireball from a very early age. Even, we were doing sonograms when my wife was pregnant, and she basically tied a true knot in her umbilical cord, which gets a little dicey, makes the OBs very nervous. So we got to spend about 4 weeks in the hospital, just making sure they didn't come early. She is, from a very early age, was agitated from lights, agitated from sound, agitated from sensory things like seams in her sock would just send her into a meltdown. And, it's interesting because I had another kid born 1 second later that it didn't bother him at all. The lights, the sound, everything didn't bother him. And, there is a gender difference there. But so from a very early age, we were seeing, we were seeing differences in our kids. She's a very good student, well liked by others, is active in her community, all of that. But she struggles with a whole set of differences that my son did not. Early on, the pediatrician just said, "Oh, it's a phase. She'll grow out of it," and that was 3 years old, and then she got to be 9 years old, and it was something the symptoms just got a little bit more extreme and more exacerbated, and it took her longer to bounce back from the sensory overload and that sort of thing. So around the time she hit puberty, early teenage years, everything really sort of got serious and kind of came to a head. Pediatricians wanted to say, "Oh, it's puberty, it's normal, they'll grow out of it." But at this point, it got so serious that we were afraid for her safety. There was some self-harm that came into the conversation, so we kind of broke with convention and sought out psychiatric help for her, and it was life-changing. We found a cognitive behavioral therapist that was able to diagnose her with autism spectrum disorder, and it explained a lot of what we had been seeing for the past decade or so. I wish we had found the behavioral therapist much earlier. I think it's important that we did find her. So it has really helped Liberty to sort of cope with some of the things that she has been dealing with. One of the things that is an aspect of autism spectrum disorder is that so the cause is not known. As the cause is not known, it makes it very difficult to treat the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. And so you find yourself, jumping through just myriad treatment options. You try them for 3 months and then you move on to the next thing. Fortunately, there are combination therapies that are fairly well documented as being helpful for autism patients. So we are currently on that journey. We have also learned that there is quite a bit of clinical research in autism going on right now. So we have done several observational autism studies. So clinical trials fall into several different categories. You can have observational, where you go to the doctor's office, they give you questionnaires about how, quality of life and things like that. But there is no real therapy, no procedure, no medication to take. So we've done some observational therapies. We are currently involved in a clinical trial right now. It is also observational, but it's for the whole family because they are testing specifically twins where one has autism and one does not, because there is, I think, fairly obvious benefits to having two such close to genetic copies of each other, where one has autism and the other one does not. So they are looking to compare genomes of my children to see if there's some non-overlap there, so that they can kind of isolate maybe an autism gene, I think is the thinking there. That is what kind of the point of the discussion is, that it may not actually help my daughter to find out if there's an autism gene, but it could absolutely help her children or help her grandchildren. So it was said a very long time ago that you don't plant a tree for yourself, right? You plant it for your kids or your grandkids because it takes 50 years for one to get to a substantial size. And I kind of see clinical research studies and our participation in those clinical research studies as planting a tree. And so I would just implore you to go and ask your healthcare provider about clinical trials and see if there is anything that would match, with whatever you are dealing with. And basically, we can all plant a tree for our children and grandchildren to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Cory. Why don't you stay up there because we can do some Q&A now.
Okay.
But thank you, Cory. We appreciate you sharing not only your expertise but also your personal story with us. And since we do have some time for Q&A with the audience, if you have a question, feel free to wave. Oh, okay, there he goes.
Thank you very much, Cory, for sharing your story and your background. I'm with a company called Black Health Matters, and certainly Biden administration was very forceful in terms of their efforts to have diversity within the trials. We don't know what's going to happen at this time. However, I work with pharmaceutical companies and CROs that look to create opportunities for education and hopefully a call to action for participation. One of the issues that we've come across is the pharmaceutical companies not really necessarily understanding those cultural subtle differences. You mentioned things like, and certainly that's a wonderful response in terms of providing child care and things of that nature to help people through the process. What has been your experience in terms of the pharma companies really sort of going beyond just moving people to clinicaltrials.gov, but trying to create an environment for participants to move through the process?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. Pharmaceutical companies are quite large organizations. So even if you could convince everyone today that a change needs to happen, it's a very sort of large and lumbering beast. It takes quite a while to sort of course correct. Over the past, I would say 3 to 5 years, we have seen quite a bit of a course correction in pharma's ability to partner with patient orgs and patient and site engagement orgs to really find out what is on patients' minds, because it's really, it's unfortunate in the respect of pharma not being able to really interface with patients, because there's a lot of legal tape there that, for very good reasons, pharma can't really directly interface with a patient. So we have to have third parties to go between for that information. So because there have to be other parties also involved, it makes the sort of slow process even a little bit slower. But there have been definite, there has been progress in the last couple of years, and I only see that increasing.
Thank you so much. In the same vein, I have a question, and then I'll pass it to my sister. Are there any longitudinal studies, in particular, for kidney trials?
I don't have that information right off the top of my head. I have a very strong guess that there are, but that would be something I'd be happy to discuss with you later.
My question is kind of two in one. How might one encourage an interested patient who has multiple complex compound chronic illnesses and might feel like, oh, I've got, too much going on, and how would I be considered and that sort of thing? How might you kind of encourage them to still maybe pursue that? And then with that, if you could provide some further clarity on how exactly to engage those questions and just the opportunities, whether that's directly with their doctor or pharmaceutical company and that sort of thing.
Yep,
Thank you.
Absolutely. So you make a very fair point. So science and research tries to have a very narrow focus because if you treat patients that have maybe, say, 12 medical conditions, who's to say that the other 11 don't confound the results of the one under scrutiny for the study? And while that is, theoretically true, it is also true that there are no patients with only one thing going on with them. And I think it's been a little bit of a slow making progress there. But clinical development teams have been receptive recently to the fact that you can't find someone with only a cardiovascular disease. You can't find someone only with renal disease. You have to make considerations and be able to take that data and then parse out the results. And what can be done is you collect a whole bunch of data at once, and then there's a neat little statistics trick called stratification. At the end of the study, when you have all this data, you can say, okay, here were the results. What happens to the data if we pull out all patients who have cardiovascular disease? Well, then it changes the data. What happens if we pull out everyone with some sort of autoimmune disease? Okay, well then it changes the data a little bit more this other direction. And the FDA has been very supportive of being more inclusive of the patient populations with multiple sort of underlying disease as long as we're able to stratify the results and say, okay, yeah, well, we had 1,000 patients, but here are the results of these, this subgroup. Here are the results of another subgroup. So it is currently underway. I think we're making strides. Again, you have to re-educate every university student who comes out of the lab, because in the lab, you want the temperature to be perfect, you want the humidity to be perfect, you want everything to be very tightly controlled, and that kind of correlates into clinical research as well. They want everything to be very well controlled and only to have these very narrow set of criteria, and that's just not people in real life. As far as how to engage, it is a good question, and it can be quite confusing. I know now because I've been looking for clinical trials for my daughter as well. We honestly just started out by searching for advocacy groups, starting out with autism advocacy, patient advocacy. It will direct you to a center, and it may be like a university academic center. Okay, so come to find out that university academic center didn't have anything that directly was applicable to you, but you scroll to the bottom of the page and they will have a link to another advocacy group which you follow. It's a bit of a rabbit hole, but I would just say follow those crumbs until you get closer to, it will give you ideas, get you closer to where you want to be. And then of course, asking your primary care provider. If you're not currently at a specialist, you can ask for a referral to a specialist. A lot of times, I'm from a very rural area, and it's they are general practitioners. They are masters of everything and specialists of nothing. Obviously, that's not exactly the case, but find an expert, find a specialist.
I think you just answered my question, which is, I'm on the NIH list to receive studies that are beginning. But they say, if you're well, what does well mean? So I just kind of pass them up. So your idea of them stratifying who they're going to see and who they're not is really great. I mean, I participate in research, but not when it says, are you well?
So I have a question for you, and I do a lot of clinical trials where actually I get eliminated from a lot of them because I'm a care partner. And with you having a daughter that's autistic, when she's asked a question if something impacts her. She may say no, but you as parents know that that is impacting her quite a bit.
Sure.
Kind of like the same thing with my wife, where she's saying, well, I feel good today. I'm like, well, no, you don't. You puked 6 times today. Yeah, you may have not puked 7 times, but when are we going to open the, do you have any answer of how we can open this up to more care partners? Because when I interact with them, I'll be like, I want to be part of this study. And they're like, you can't, you don't have kidney disease. I'm like, yes, but I'm in kidney disease more than you know.
So I don't have any, direct answers for that. I will say that more and more I'm seeing where, a caretaker will also have like a quality of life questionnaire for the patient. And those are compared with the patient. Because like you said, everything's relative. Are you doing better? Or are you doing good today? Yes. You may say yes, your partner may say no, or vice versa. But I think there's a lot of sort of maybe confounding factors. You could have something else going on. You could be stressed about a job. You could be stressed about something, and it sort of affects your responses to that questionnaire, or the same with your caretaker. But I think it is important to include caretakers' opinions and perspectives in the clinical trial results, because a patient may be dealing with their illness and not be able to really have an objective view of what the questionnaire is asking. Yep.
Well, thank you, Cory. That was wonderful, and that's all the time we have for our session today. A big thank you to Bear for their support in helping make the sessions possible.